Welcome to our session on integration of relationship-based practices within a PBIS framework. I'm Stephanie Martinez.
And I'm Lauren Ivanovich. The objectives for this training will be to define the term relationship-based practices, identify common relationship-based practices, describe how relationship-based practices may be used within a multi-tiered PBIS framework, and identify next steps for implementation of relationship-based practices.
The agenda for today are twofold. First, we're going to explore what relationship-based practices are and what behavioral, social, and life skills are and give you an overview. And then we'll talk next about what you want to do if you want to adopt and embed relationship-based practices at your school.
This slide walks you through the phases of effective implementation for practice. It's a much larger process when we're thinking about how we are going to implement something, and today we're really going to focus on those relationship-based practices within your PBIS framework. And we really want to think about first here, this yellow part of exploration. We want to think about, do we really need it? We're going to answer these questions through the next couple of slides to think through what's the change identified that we need, what are the research possible solutions, thinking about relationship-based practices, and how will we obtain our stakeholder buy-in for such implementation. When you walk through the rest of these phases of implementation, you have to think about it being a long-term piece. So this is 2 to 4 years for just getting things in place. To go from exploration to full implementation. So we're going to walk you through some of those pieces.
Let me take a second and think. What is all the buzz about relationship-based practices? So when you heard that term, what do you think about? What do you know about relationship-based practices? The other thing we want to know about is, what do you know about behavior, social, and life skills? So what are those skills that are being taught for students on your campus? So think about those for a couple seconds, pause the recording, and then unpause, and we'll move ahead.
We're now going to move on to the Behavioral, Social, and Life Skills section, or BSL. This section is going to provide you an overview of the philosophy of relationship-based practices and how it works within behavioral, social, and life skills.
So you may be asking yourself, what exactly are behavioral, social, and life skills? So here's just a definition that we came up with that gives you an idea of what this is. So when we're thinking about behavioral, social, and life skills, those are the skills that we need as individuals to be lifelong learners, to work collaboratively, whether it's at home, school, or work. So some examples are listed on here. Just 1 or 2 of them are showing empathy for others and making responsible choices.
The next section we're going to cover are relationship-based practices. This is going to just kind of be a general philosophy and provide you some goals within RBPs. This is to help you have a general understanding. We're going to go in more detail a little bit later as well. When we think about a relationship-based approach, we want to think about it having an aim to develop and repair harm. So we're thinking about that when harm has occurred to a relationship, to the community, or to the offender or the person that has created the harm and those conditions for their actions. Something we want to think about here is highlighted there in the green on the very bottom, that people respond best when you do things with them, not to or for them. And one of the big pieces of information here that's important to understand is that first we have to have a relationship built in order to develop, to be able to develop and repair the harm to that relationship. So when we're thinking about our relationship-based practices, we want to make sure that we are really focusing on that relational piece before we're ready to start thinking about repairing the harm to any situation.
We have 5 guiding principles for relationship-based practices, or called the 5 R's. First one is relationships, which we've talked a little bit about already. Relationships where we A, either need to build, or B, need to build and strengthen, or C, just strengthen those relationships. These relationships are student to student, student to adults, and adult to adults. The next R is respect. So everyone has respect for each other. So respect between students, again, respect between adults, and a respect between student and adults. The next one is responsibility. The big emphasis here is that when a relationship has been harmed, taking the responsibility to try to repair that relationship. So that goes into restoration. That's where the parties that are involved come together and they decide how they are going to repair that relationship. And it usually does involve some responsibility of taking some action steps to repair that relationship. And then the last part is reintegration. So that is taking a student or an adult in a situation where their harm has been caused and welcoming them back into that environment. It could be at the school level, it could be at the classroom level, and it could also, again, be adults and or with students as well.
Next, we're going to talk about the goals of RBP. So they're listed here for you, but we want to highlight a couple of things. So when you're implementing RBP, or relationship-based practices with Fidelity, we see things like an inclusive school community. We see positive relationships being shared by all stakeholders. That means our staff, our students, and our families in our greater community. We also show a less reliance on exclusionary discipline practices. One of the things highlighted here is that RBP is incompatible with an approach that focuses only on punitive or exclusionary consequences. That doesn't mean that we don't have exclusionary practices or consequences that are punitive, but that this means that if we're implementing RBPs with Fidelity, we have a less reliance on those because we've built more of those positive relationships at the beginning, and we have alternatives as part of our approach to discipline. Then you can also see the other two listed there for those inclusion of our community members and stakeholder voice and collaboration being evident across all of our practices.
So when we think of relationship-based practices, or RBP, there's 2 categories. Those that are prevention or proactive, so that's the building of those and strengthening of those relationships. So you can see listed here we have 3 main strategies. One are affective statements. Another one is circles, and we'll go into the variety of circles a little bit later, and informal conferences. So that's the building those relationships between the different parties at the school campus. And then responsive practices. So these are the practices that are used after there has been an incident of harm that has occurred. So it's in response to a behavior. So this is where you're trying to repair those relationships between those individuals who caused harm and received harm. And so you can see there are some different choices there. There's a variety of practices that can be used. So things like repairing circles or repairing chats, peer mediation, peer juries, and then there's some different alternatives to suspension and expulsion that may be used in lieu, so family group conferences and community repairing conferences.
When we're thinking about implementation of RBP within PBIS, we want to do this as a whole school approach. So on the left-hand side, you see a triangle with Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. This is what it might look like to have a continuum of RBP across your PBIS tiers. So when we're at Tier 1, we really want to focus on that building and strengthening of relationships. You might use things like community building circles. You can also see here on the green on the right the list of those preventative strategies. So things like questioning, effective statements and scripts, checking in circles, and using a behavioral social life skills curriculum. Those will all be your things that all individuals within your school and in your environment should be able to access as Tier 1. As you move up the continuum and up the triangle into Tier 2 and Tier 3, those are when some sort of harm has occurred and you might be doing some repairing, and then you might implement some accountability things. So as you're moving up the continuum, you have more of those reactive or responsive strategies, things like repairing meetings, mediation, peer juries, and community repairing conferencing. As you move up the continuum, the time increases, and as does the staff availability and training to be able to do some of these things. So just because there is a continuum here, you do not need to be doing all of these things. They are not likely all needed or things that can be effective for your specific setting. You want to think about, what does your data look like? What does your availability of resources, meaning both time and staff, look like? And really match those to the needs to then identify which of these relationship building practices would fit and work for your setting.
We often get asked about the research around relationship building practices. So we've had a couple opportunities to go through and look at the literature based around these practices. So you can see we have 4 different types of studies that we reviewed, some which are less stringent, all the way more up to more stringent research methods. So the first and least stringent is student outcomes. So just looking at, if we do these practices, do we see a decrease in discipline incidents? Then we have some non-experimental studies that take place. So things like doing focus groups, surveying staff about their perceptions around the practices, all the way up to what we call the gold star or the standard, which is randomized control groups, which essentially means one group of students gets the practice while another doesn't, and then looking to see if there are differences in outcomes as a result. So those are the different type of practices. Most of the research for relationship-based practices falls along these student outcomes and non-experimental studies, but over time we've seen an increase of a variety of studies. If you want more information about those studies and research around relationship-based practices, we do have a little handout that you can access online with this recording that goes over the different studies and some more information. It does include the citations for those.
The next section we're going to cover are the common relationship-based practices. We're going to talk about effective statements, circles, and conferences. Here are some types of relationship-based practices that we are going to delve into. Effective statements are things that we use every day. You'll hear some I statements. Circles, things like morning meetings, problem-solving class-wide issues, and the implementation of behavioral social life skills instruction. There's also repairing conferences, which look like informal conferencing, repairing meetings and chats, and those reintegration procedures. How do we restore the relationships that are there between someone who is harmed and the person causing harm? We want to match that to the severity of the incident. Some of these are those proactive pieces, such as the effective statements and circles, and others are more of those reactionary or responsive, such as those repairing conferences and reintegration procedures.
Right now we're going to move into the first relationship-based practices called effective statements. So it's the first proactive or preventative RBP strategy. So we want you to think for a second and pause this recording and think about, what do you need to do to teach empathy to students? Or what are you currently doing for teaching empathy for students? Big portion of effective statements will be about empathy or having an understanding of how my behavior is impacting somebody else. So we're going to be teaching that to students, and then we want students to then understand how their behavior impacts others. So just think, what are you currently doing to teach empathy, or what do you need to do to teach empathy? You might want to pause this and reflect for a second before listening to the rest of the recording.
Affective statements are personal expressions of feeling in response to specific positive or negative behaviors of others. You may have heard these, such as I statements, before, such as the ones listed out for you below. When we're thinking about using affective statements, we're really hitting in that idea of empathy. We want to make the person who caused harm aware of the impact of their actions, which is empathy. We have to help to teach that, and one of the ways to do that is through the use of affective statements. This helps to change the dynamic between individuals, especially when a teacher starts to use affective statements towards students to really show that, hey students, our behavior doesn't just impact ourselves, but it also can impact the adults or other peers around us. This becomes the building block for teaching empathy to our students and really to other adults or other individuals within our settings. Some examples listed here. It's often easy to think about those negative behaviors. I may feel frustrated when you don't address my questions during training, but we want to also think about those positive affective statements as well, such as I feel happy when homework is completed because it shows me how well you understand the topic.
So we gave you some examples in the previous slide of affective statements. The next two slides will give you kind of sentence stems to help you become more comfortable when using those I statements. So the first step is you want to refer to the behavior that you observed. So there's some examples on here. When I see, when I hear, are some of those examples. So when I see you turning your homework in on time, could be part of it. And then the next step will go into the next slide. So the second part of an I statement is then stating how the behavior affects you. So if you remember from step one, it's saying what you saw or observed. And the second part is how the behavior is affecting you. So I started with, I see you turning your homework in on time, and I feel happy because I know you took the time to review your work at home yesterday. Here's some other examples as well. And as we said, those I statements can be for behaviors that are both positive and then behaviors that maybe are negative or have a negative impact on the other individuals.
This slide helps to put together that format. So if you use those first two sentence stems, you can now see how this might be another option, an I statement format. So I feel blank when blank because blank. What you'll see here are two very different ones, and you might not notice the difference, but the first sentence format or structure has the word you in it. The second one removes you as that identifier. We understand that, and we really would love to be at that second one where we are removing the blame and at all into the you piece, but we know that just like when we scaffold things for education, for teaching math, for example, we may also need to provide scaffolds to really thinking about empathy and teaching affective statements. Sometimes people are not ready and comfortable to move completely away from that potential blame and shame piece. So this helps you to see the difference and move towards away from using you and just identifying the behavior and how it impacts.
One way to help you start practicing using affective statements is to think of maybe common phrases or your common responses to behaviors that you observe on a regular basis. So here are some with students, but with their families. So you might even want to start thinking about maybe your own significant other or your own kids at home and how you typically respond. Like, hey, I told you 10 times now to put on your shoes. Now we're going to be late. Well, that's a common response I might use at home with my son. So then I might want to change it to an I statement. So I feel very frustrated when I have to ask you multiple times to put your shoes on because I feel like you're not listening to me and unappreciated about my time. So it's just a good way to practice using those I statements to get a little bit more comfortable with them. When we're thinking about the integration of RBPs into your school's discipline flowchart, this is just an example for you of a school flowchart for PBIS. So when we're thinking about RBPs, we want to make sure we're thinking about how are we integrating it into our existing framework or our PBIS framework as well. So here you can see highlighted within some of the areas of yellow for the sample interventions, using affective statements in the classroom around your third step, as well as in the office when we're thinking about using affective statements on our reflections. Now we're going to go into our second preventative or proactive RBP strategy called circles. So what exactly are circles? Circles are a process where we're bringing individuals together. So it could be students and students, it could be students and adults, it can be adults and adults together, but it's a very structured process, and we're going to go through that process of bringing people together and building relationships, understanding feelings, and sometimes even solving problems. Down at the bottom, you see some different types of circles. You may have heard these languages being used in the past. The circles in green are, again, those that are more preventative or proactive in building relationships or building and problem solving some maybe class-wide issues. So you may have heard of morning meetings or community circles or check-in circles, whereas the ones in blue are more of those responsive circles that you will use after there has been an incident of harm that needs to be resolved and relationships need to be repaired and rebuilt. So when we're thinking about our circles, there's actually a topography of what it should look like. So when we think of a circle, it should truly be in a circle. Sometimes it might look more like an amoeba or something along those lines, depending upon the structure or the space that you're working with. But we want it to look as much as a circle as possible so that everyone can see one another. All folks should also have equal status. So in the picture you're seeing, everyone is sitting. If you are going to have everyone sit, perhaps you're in elementary school and the traditional way that you see it is that all of your class is sitting and the teacher is standing. Well, we would actually ask that you would then sit as well. So if all of your students are sitting, you're sitting. If you're not comfortable sitting, then have everyone stand or bring chairs to have everyone sit in chairs. We really want to think about all members having that same level of status. One isn't larger or bigger or more important than the other. And in fact, you have a facilitator as opposed to a teacher role in this. So there is a designated facilitator of circles, but that eventually we would hope would become a student as well as the instructor or the teacher of the room. We want to think about expectations, and here again is where we might align these to our school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports expectations. So things like being honest, showing respect, or following structures might be examples. Everyone has the opportunity to participate as part of your circle, but participation is optional, and we want to make sure we stress that. Sometimes it's hard for us to allow our students or folks in the circle to skip or to pass, but that certainly is always welcomed as part of your circle. As we mentioned, there is a structure to a circle, so we're going to introduce in a second the 4 parts that should be done in a circle. There's a greeting or a focusing moment, and we'll go over when you would use a greeting versus a focusing moment. Then there's the next is the connections feeling check-in. Third is your activity, and then the last part of the circle is the closing. We always recommend that when you are doing a circle, whether it's a morning meeting, a check-in, a community building circle, that you follow these components in this order every time. The first part of our circles, or component of our circles, is this greeting or focusing moment. So when we're first happening to have our greeting, it happens every time. Always it sets our positive tone. Everyone in the circle is included in the greeting or the focusing moment. And here are some times when we might use a greeting versus a focusing moment.
When we're thinking about greetings, we say the students' names. So for example, we would all say, "Good morning, my name is Lauren," and you might say, "Hi, Lauren," back to me. We would do that for everyone in the circle as our greeting. Good times to use greetings are at the beginning of the school year, coming back from breaks, when you're starting to develop your new community within your classroom or your school or your staff meetings, however you're doing them. Also, really great to do greetings when you're saying names, when you have new students in your class as well. Then you might want to do focusing moments of things like you're coming back from specials, or you're coming back you're starting in the beginning of the day, or you're at the end of the day and everyone's ready to go home. This focusing moments would be something like, take a deep breath, everyone close your eyes, do some practice breathing, mindfulness, things like that. There are also some examples of greetings listed for you here on the slide. And there are many different ones that you can use. We want to make sure that either our greeting or our focusing moment are both respectful and friendly. And this is a very short time frame. So this is usually very quick, between 2 to 5 minutes. It's the opening and setting the tone for your circle.
The second part of the circle is the connections or feeling check-ins. It gives you an opportunity to assess how the participants in our circle are currently feeling. So you'll notice here this emotion kind of poster where students can identify a feeling, or a staff member can identify a feeling of how they're doing. It lets you know as the facilitator where participants are along the emotional continuum. It can also let you know as a teacher, wow, Sally is usually very happy and upbeat, and she's a little bit sad today. Maybe I need to check in with her a little bit later. Or maybe I do this feeling check-in and realize that a lot of students maybe in my circle today are having some maybe sad feelings, and maybe we don't want to do the lesson on taking turns. Instead, we want to turn the circle into maybe a relationship building circle. So it might help you identify that you need to switch your circle around a little bit. Again, we want to have everybody have the opportunity to share, but it's okay if they want to pass. That is their sharing. Just like with the greeting or focusing moment, it should be pretty quick and pretty simple. Some of our favorite ones to do for a check-in or feelings check-in is asking people to identify in a continuum of 1 to 5 how they're feeling. Where the 1 might be you're really sleepy and tired, and a 5 might be I'm energized and I'm ready to go. And then you give them some other for 2, 3, 4, and 5 and say, okay, on the count of 3, I want everybody to raise their finger up of how they're feeling. And again, as we're working with our middle school students and high school students, if it's number 1, we want to really emphasize 1 is your pointer finger. The third part of our circle is the activity. Now this is the bulk, the longest part of your circle, and it can have different purposes. So it can be things like discussing a classroom issue, like name calling. It can be to review those school-wide expectations. So especially at the beginning of the year, coming back from breaks, what does it look like to be respectful in the classroom might be the activity. So perhaps you'll have students act them out, you'll do examples, non-examples, you can have them think, pair, share. That could be something that you do to review those school-wide expectations. You can review procedures really quickly, maybe before we go to lunch, what does it look like? And then we can also use it to teach those social, behavioral, and life skills. So maybe how to handle disappointment. Circles can also be used to teach academics as well. So those are different things that you can do. And this might take 5 to 10 minutes. It could also take a half an hour, 30 minutes. It really just depends on what the bulk and the purpose is for your circle. The fourth and final part of our circle is the closing. This is just to signal to our participants, whether it's the students or the adults, that our circle is going to come to an end. Just like with a greeting and focusing moment, it's quick and short, but it's just to let us know that it's ending. So for trauma-informed practices, it's that predictability and routine and closure. So there's lots of ways of doing this. Here's some examples on there. A common one is some reflections, maybe something I learned today if you're doing an academic circle or behavioral social life skills lesson. We had a teacher who was big into yoga, so he would do a yoga pose with his students. Another teacher played the guitar, and so he would learn the popular songs the kids were singing, and he would sing the main part of the song, and then the kids would respond with the chorus. So there's lots of different things, but another very common one is just letting students know, okay, now that the circle is done, these are the different things that we're doing next in our classroom.
So now that you know the 4 parts of the circle, you might be asking yourself, why do we use circles for teaching? Why would we need to do this? It is an existing teaching method or tool for you to use. You can use existing lesson plans. For example, if it does not address behavior or social life skills, you can use a circle to help you to do that. It offers that structure that benefits beyond our traditional classroom arrangements. So it can be very trauma informed, as we just kind of talked about, because it offers that predictability. It's building the relationships in a structured manner. It's building connections within our classroom and offering a way for an additional tool for teaching. We also know that responsive circles support problem-solving skills. So we really are trying to teach those problem-solving skills for life, as well as addressing the problems that are occurring within our settings. Here are examples of circles at schools. So these are true examples from schools that we've worked with. There are some that are for teaching, things like expectations and rules, addressing a class-wide behavior issue, or staff being inconsistent with performing hallway duty. There's also community building circles. So here are some examples like establishing circle norms and agreements. They practice listening skills with 2 round circle questions, modeling what it looks like and what it sounds like. And then also the problem-solving examples. So one of my favorite here is the staff and being in disagreement about gum chewing and whether or not it's allowed on campus. There are many other ones, but here are some just trying to give you an examples.
As we're talking about RBP and PBIS and in the integration, we need to think about when you would use these practices in your discipline process. So just to start to think about, okay, what type of practices would we use affective statements for? And what type of behaviors would we use circles for? So thinking about what type of minor behaviors could we address using a circle in the classroom? Remember, we're not pointing out a specific student, but a class-wide issue. So in high school, it could be students not coming to class on time. It can be students not turning their homework in. So thinking about that, and when could we do that in our classroom? Now that we've gone over the proactive or preventative RBP practices, we're going to move into the different practices or some of the practices that may be used to repair harm after it's been caused. So we're going to start with repairing conferences.
This slide reviews the Continuum of Conferences. So it's going to start with minor behaviors for things like informal conferencing and moving towards more of those that have really resulted in major harm and maybe being things like repairing conferences. So those are more of our major behaviors. Specific preparation might be needed, planning for follow-up. So we're really going to focus more today on those informal conferencing, repairing chats, and those repairing meetings, and giving kind of an overview of how these types of conferences can be impactful within RBPs.
So the first type of RBP are just like very informal conferences. You might have noticed some minor behavior that a student's doing that's, maybe they're a little bit off task, they're talking to their friend next to them. It's not a whole lot of structure in it, but you're kind of redirecting the student to get back on tasks and maybe prompting them. So here's some example on here of a time that could be used. Just think about those minor things that take place in a classroom, and you don't want to disrupt a lot of class, but you want the student back focused on the task at hand.
The next piece of conferencing on our continuum is the repairing chat. This is a very prescribed chat and it is these 7 questions. So every time you have a repairing chat opportunity, you go through all of these 7 questions. What you'll notice on here is we do not ask the question of why did this happen. We really are trying to get more towards those empathy skills and owning what has happened, telling what has happened, what were they thinking at the time, who did this affect, and then really helping what can we do to ensure it doesn't happen again. So when you move on to this next part of the continuum, these are those 7 questions that you would use all the time.
Okay, so this is a more time-intensive, more structured process between parties when there has been harm caused. It does have a very structured meeting that does take place. There is some preparation work that needs to take place before you actually have the meeting with all participants. So those who both caused harm, it could be more than one person, and those that were harmed, which could be more than one person. This could be both between students and adults, and between adults and adults. Just keeping in mind that you need to have a facilitator that's great, has great interpersonal skills to facilitate this meeting, and does require a lot of training before they do it. The intent of this is bringing all the parties together to have a conversation regarding the harm with the intent of repairing the harm and having an action plan of sorts on how that harm is going to be repaired. The way that it's decided about how that happens is between those who caused harm and those who are harmed. They are the parties that decide what those steps will look like to repair that relationship.
Something we want to keep in mind that we kind of just talked about is this administrative action versus the repairing outcome. So when we are using a repairing conference, we are moving away from the administrative action and moving into the repairing outcome. So when we have an action that is assigned to the student, that's an administrative action. Now we want to really be moving towards that repairing outcomes if we're using a repairing conferencing. So that's when the outcome is the outcome of the discussion. So examples being conflict resolution, community service, individual or collaborative projects. So we're moving away from administrative actions being assigned to the students, but instead having that conversation as part of the repairing conference or meeting become the outcome is the consequence, for another word choice.
Since we are aligning RBP practices with a PBIS framework, we need to think about your district student code of conduct and different behaviors. So this is just an example. Again, it's just an example of how one school may think of, okay, which type of RBP practices should we use with which types of behaviors? So some of our school districts in Florida categorize behaviors as level 1 and 2, so low level, less intense behaviors, and then move up the continuum with levels 3 and 4, which are more severe behaviors. And then they aligned which practices would be appropriate at which levels based on the different type of behaviors that have been observed. So again, it's just an example of how you could align the different RBP practices with the different levels within your student code of conduct.
Again, we want to visit our school discipline flowchart and think about the integration of more responsive or reactive RBPs and how they fit into your existing PBIS flowchart. So again, we want to think about most often, where does this look when there is an office discipline referral, or if there's something in the classroom that we might use like an informal conference or a repairing chat.
The last RBP practice that we're going to talk about is the reintegration procedures. So this is how you then bring students back or adults back on campus after there has been the harm to reintegrate them into the school or classroom community. So on this slide, you will see a definition for reintegration from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. But really, what does this look like on a school campus? Well, part of reintegration should be part of that discipline process. So anytime a student is removed from a classroom, they are removed from the school, whether it's part of the time and in-school suspension, if it's longer and out-of-school suspension, or even if they've been assigned to an alternative school and then they return, or they're part of DJJ and then they return. The reintegration process will look different from when a student just removed from classroom temporarily to come back in comparison to a student who's been at an alternative school and then returns. The part here is that we are wanting to set up a plan and process to make that student successful when they return and let them know that we are happy that they are back and we want to see them successful on our campus and be a productive member of our school and classroom.
Here are some examples of what reintegration could look like at a school. So you can read the 3 different bullet points, but the one I want to highlight is the first one, because often I think we really know how to do reintegration from an alternative education program or suspension, or at least that can be more forefront on our minds. But when we also want to think about reintegration when coming back from a classroom removal. So maybe the student had to take a walk, or maybe they got sent to the office. This is an example where a student completed a reflection sheet based on the repairing chat, so those 7 questions. And then when they're seen by the administrator, the reflection sheet is shared with the teacher if the teacher was impacted by the behavior, or it's shared with the student if another student was impacted by the behavior. And oftentimes then there's some closure provided there as they're then able to be reintegrated. So, as previous classroom teachers, it was always a frustration of ours when if a student was sent down to the office and then something happened there, some magic happened, and then the teacher came back in my class and I never knew what was the outcome. This allows there to be some follow through, some reintegration back, and hopefully some repairing of harm that probably occurred, even if that harm was loss of classroom time or levels of frustration. Again, we want to make sure that we're looking at how we're reintegrating the reintegration part of our RBP into our school's PBIS discipline flowchart. So that bottom green piece there under the office shows reintegration. And so what does that process and policy look like for your setting?
You may be thinking to yourself, this sounds great. We can use this all the time. I do want to caution that it is a wonderful practice, but there are times where it may not be appropriate to be used. First, to find out, is there a relationship between the 2 people who caused harm and received harm? If there's no relationship, then there's nothing to repair. It's probably not appropriate to use the practice. We also need to consider what type of incident was caused and harmed. And so we really want to caution in situation where there may have been a bullying incident of whether it's appropriate to use or not. We also need to think about the behavioral, social, and life skills of students. If students are involved, to say, do they have the ability to have empathy or perspective taking? Do they have the ability to take responsibility and come up with an action plan and follow through with it? So just really thinking about these questions and these situations before just using RBP in a situation really should be considered and thought out and planned, and make sure it's appropriate for the situation and the individuals involved. So in the last slide, we talked about, is RBP appropriate for all situations? And we said no, that there are some times when you may not want to use RBP in situations. So here's a little nice flow chart you might want to think about for your specific schools and specific behaviors about when it would be appropriate and when it would not be appropriate to use these practices. So you might want to lay this out for those common behaviors that occur on your campus, of knowing when to use it and when not to use it. It does take a little time to put this into place, but it really helps to really think through for your school campus when to use practices and when not to use practices.
As we're thinking through, okay, you know what, we really do like this. How would this look as a timeline? How would we get here? This is a sample timeline for you to think about. Again, we're really talking about and want to highlight that we are implementing RBPs within our pre-existing PBIS structure. So the first thing we need to have is school-wide expectations. So have we defined and taught them? Establishing buy-in, and then we really work through the professional development, especially around affective statements, use of behavioral social life skills for circles, role-playing circles, giving feedback on circles, all of those on the top in green being our preventative and proactive relationship building practices, before we then go to the things on the bottom in the red, being those repairing chats, informal conferencing, and things like that are more of our reactive practices or responsive practices. Regardless of our timeline, we just want to highlight that we are always sharing our data on fidelity and effectiveness.
So again, this slide is just wrapping up the different type of relationship-based practices that we reviewed today. Remember, we started with our proactive preventative practices of affective statements and circles, and then we gave you an overview of our responsive RBP practices about repairing conferences and different type of repairing procedures to repair the harm that had been caused. Again, this is just another wrap-up slide going through each of the different types of RBPs that we went through. It kind of breaks down for you who will do these practices, how frequently should they be done or recommendations, and then what does it require. So the previous slide just kind of gave you a reminder of what the practices are, and this kind of breaks down a little bit as a reminder again, who does it, what the frequency is, and what it requires for you to put the practice into place.
So as we've wrapped up, we're going to walk you through some next steps, some questions to ask yourself. And we're going to go through each of these questions, these 6 questions listed out for you in depth, but we want you to have an idea of where we're going.
At the beginning of the talk today, we talked about the different phases of implementation. And the first part of this session, we talked about exploring. Do we need it? We gave you an overview. Now we're kind of moving into the next part of, can it work at our school site? And so the questions that we're going to ask you for the remainder of the day can help you do that planning piece and thinking about, can it work on our school site? Do we have the resources? Do we have the personnel? And do we have the data that systems that could make it effective on our specific school campus?
The first question you want to ask yourself is kind of this 3-part piece. Do I, my first me, does my PBIS team, and then 3, does the staff buy in? Do my philosophical beliefs align with RBPs? Does my PBIS team philosophical beliefs align? Does our staff have philosophical beliefs that align with RBP? Will everyone on the PBIS team and administrative team support the use of RBP practices? Which ones might you support? Where does our staff stand? And how do we know that? So we might have an idea of, oh yeah, you know, sometimes I've heard some people are okay with these things, but we want to know, what does our stakeholders truly believe? So give them an overview, show some video clips, and survey your staff to ensure that we actually have that buy-in and we have the data to say we have that buy-in.
The second set of questions are really around what are our current policies and practices around discipline on our campus. So first, what are we doing to teach those expectations, our rules on campus, our behavioral social life skills? What methods are we using and how frequent are we doing it? And are all of our staff doing that? And the second piece we really have stressed today is, what are the relationships like between our staff and students? Do we have good, positive relationships? What about our relationships between students to students and relationships between staff to staff? Do we need to work on building those relationships up first? Then, once we have all of that great prevention stuff in place, and we've done a really fabulous job of effective statements and circles, then we know we've got those great relationships. Then we can start to look into the more reactive, responsive practices. You will know when you're ready because you have that empathy in the relationships, and then you start to use your data to identify, okay, on our campus, what are the most common problem behaviors we're seeing, and what types of RBP do we have staff support, we have the ability to implement to address behaviors that it would match. And is there consistency of our staff that could do and provide those responsive practices?
The third question is around the personnel resources that we have available at our specific site. So, do you have any staff who are currently knowledgeable on RBP practices? Can they then train the rest of your staff? If you're going to have relationship-based conferences or repairing conferences, do you have individuals who could facilitate that? If so, what training would they need? How would you fund that? Various conversations like that. Same around individuals to facilitate reintegration. And what type of reintegration do we want to look at, and what training would they need?
The next question to ask is, what time do we have to dedicate to RBP practices? And when we think about time, we not only think about the time that we need to implement those practices, but it also requires the time to train all of our staff and provide PD around the different types of RBPs we're doing. Now, if you remember back to the triangle earlier, all of our staff would need training on affective statements and circles, but only those maybe who are facilitating those responsive conferences might need that type of training. We often get asked, how often do we use circles in the classroom? And that's something that you'll have to decide on your specific campus. How frequently do we want those happening? Some schools say it's elementary, that's our morning meeting every morning. We have other schools who say we want to start the week with a community building circle, we want to end the week with a community building circle. So those are just some questions to ask yourself. The other one that has come up a couple times from some of our teachers is they want to know that if they are doing a community building circle, it's supported by administration. So if administration comes in and sees me doing a community building circle or a circle for teaching behavioral social life skills, when it's my reading time, that I'm supported in doing that and that it's okay. Then the other part, when we think more about those more responsive, do we have the time and the ability to do those pre-conferences? Do we have the personnel to support those pre-conferences all the way through actually doing those circles and then following up with those action plans that are developed during those responsive circles? And then the last is, if we are doing reintegration, do we have the time and the ability to do it every single time a student is removed from the classroom and they go to the office? Maybe we don't have that time, but maybe we do have time when every time a student returns from an alternative learning center to do those practices. So you'll need to figure out the answers to these questions to really think about which practices your school can adopt and implement within your PBIS framework.
So now you're saying, we like this. This sounds great. This is something that we want and that we need at our school, and we're ready to really delve deeper into it. So now what? Well, once you and your PBIS and administration team has reviewed this presentation and come to consensus on those previous questions that we've reviewed, you have an idea of what you're thinking and where you're ready to go. Your administrator needs to contact your PBIS district coordinator for your district to arrange for an RBP training. This recording is a preview, not a training. So we can talk with you about next steps once you have the consensus and that stakeholder buy-in.
And to wrap up, this is our contact information for the FL-PBIS project. If you want additional tools, resources, and questions, this is our website, our Twitter page, and our YouTube page. Thank you for joining us today.